We are today with John Salza. How are you doing, John?
Very good. Nice to be with you, Ezekiel.
I will make a brief introduction. We'll do a kind of a dialogue or debate with John. John will defend the position that the SSPX ministry is illicit, and I will play the devil's advocate, like if I was a member of the SSPX. So, John, you want to introduce yourself for anyone who might not know you?
Thank you for the opportunity. I am a Catholic apologist. I've been in Catholic apologetics for over 25 years. I've written a number of books, a lot of them dealing with scripture, dealing with Freemasonry, Fatima, written hundreds of articles and given talks throughout the world at conferences and parishes. And so, I'm here to defend the faith.
Excellent. Can you tell us briefly what is your past in the SSPX?
I attended Mass there for almost 15 years on weekends. When my family and I moved to a different location, I discovered that there was a traditional Mass chapel very nearby, like 12 minutes away. And so we began to attend Mass there on the weekends. That was when my kids were very young, and I wanted to raise them, with the traditional Mass and the traditional sacraments. During that entire time, though, I was also attending the diocesan Latin Mass as well on a daily basis with the Institute of Christ the King. And so, I had one foot in the SSPX, but during that time, I became close to a lot of priests, a lot of seminarians. I really learned what they taught, understood their positions, and questioned it myself, whether their positions were correct or not. And I accepted a lot of their arguments, at least on a superficial level. I certainly did not accept all of them. I had a number of debates with society priests while I was attending the Mass, in which we disagreed. For example, the fact that I was attending an Ecclesia Day Mass, they didn't like that, and I could never resolve that position. But for the most part, I said, look, there is a crisis in the church. I grew up during the crisis. I was raised, where I fortunately had a pretty good Catholic upbringing and education. 12 years. It was relatively Orthodox formation that I had, but I can't say that for a lot of people my age. And so I recognized there was a crisis. But as I began to actually dig deeper and study the issues, I also recognized that there were excesses on the right, just as there are excesses on the left. And that's what liberalism is. Liberalism is, one's picking and choosing what they want to believe. And I concluded that, wait a minute, there is a crisis. But while the liberals have gone off the rail on one side, I concluded so did Archbishop Lefebvre on the other side, and ultimately rejecting the Roman Catholic Church ultimately, while maintaining, or at least claiming to maintain, that they hold the true faith. So I couldn't reconcile that, and then I left. I wasn't planning on being an apologist against the society, but I guess when I left with what I've been doing for so many years, people wanted to know why, and I saw a need for it. And so hence I'm doing shows like this with you to explain what I've discovered.
All right. Excellent. Thanks. So as a brief introduction, I will say I have here 22 objections in favor of the SSPX. We will see if we can get to all of them.
Okay.
So we will try to, as an introduction to the public also, we'll try to say them briefly, clearly, and to respond them concisely to the point. All right.
Okay.
We'll go with the first one. The first one is about the new Mass. It's a large paragraph, so I will read it wholly, and then we will look in the details. All right. It says, the new Mass is intrinsically evil, and the SSPX is the only one which says so. Also, the traditional Latin Mass had to be continued by someone. Thanks to the SSPX and Lefebvre, we now have the traditional Latin Mass. Also, the traditional Latin Mass cannot be prohibited. because of the document Quo Primum, which is binding for all popes. Also, every sacrament was changed, and the Church cannot do so. And the SSPX is the organization which defends those viewpoints. So it must be right. We continue. The new mass isn't.
That's a lot in point one. That's a lot in point
Yeah.
one. You've got 5 issues already on the table. So, but keep going.
Yes. Let me see. Here, the SSPX defends those viewpoints, and the missal, also the missal of the new missal, was modified with the explicit intent of making the liturgy of the whole Church more Protestant-like. The basis of that critique can be found in numerous studies of the SSPX, essentially. Also, the missal of the new missal leads necessarily to a loss of faith. Now, the supreme law is the salvation of souls. Therefore, the SSPX is justified in its rejection of the Novus Ordo and in ignoring the penalties inflicted upon them, as they are striving for the salvation of souls. Therefore, the SSPX must be right.
So, Ezekiel, I think in order to do this, we need to go point by point. You've just given a brief lecture that encompasses a lot of different points. We need to go point by point. The first statement I recall you saying is that the new mass is intrinsically evil, right?
Yes.
Where is it intrinsically evil?
I don't know. I guess it is.
Well, you just said it was. So what are you basing that on?
Yes. You know, all the propitiatory elements are gone. You know?
No, they're not. They're all there. If you look at the canon of the new mass, the word sacrifice is used 4 times in about 60 seconds.
Yes, but you know,
sacrificial victim. That's all there still.
Yes, but it's more a sacrifice of praise. You know?
No, it's not. It's called the victim, the sacrificial victim. If you look at the Novus Ordo Mass, even in the shorter canons, they refer to the sacrifice and sacrificial victim.
All right, so that is in the missal.
Absolutely. And this is the problem with these types of superficial arguments. Okay, the society apologists think that they can just make a blanket statement, and I call it a hit and run approach, but then, you know, move on to the next issue. Let's deal with this issue right here. We can look at the canon of the Mass. The long canon especially has been preserved in the Novus Ordo Mass. And there's a priest down the road that says the long canon all the time. It's identical to the Roman canon, only it's said in English. But even in the shorter canons, the sacrifice and sacrificial victim is part of those canons.
All right.
And that's simply not true.
Yes. Okay. And how can you explain the great liturgical crisis that came after the new missal? You know, you can hardly find a new mass which is good celebrated.
Yeah. Now you're asking a different question. The first statement you made was that the new mass is intrinsically evil. You haven't been able to prove that, correct? Now you're shifting to why is there a crisis? So you'll concede that you haven't proven that the new mass is intrinsically evil.
No.
Correct?
Yes, I concede that, but maybe I say. We can show that it is intrinsically evil because of its bad fruits.
What about all the good fruits that it's produced?
For example?
Full Novus Ordo parishes that have the Blessed Sacrament, that regularly go to confession, that have Eucharistic adoration. Again, you're making a general statement and applying it to the entire Roman rite, okay? And that's something that you simply can't do. When you first said, you know, the propitiatory sacrificial elements have been removed, that's not true. You can go back, Ezekiel, and read the canons. So it's certainly not intrinsically evil for an omission. I would say that it's not the rite itself, but the way it's been implemented and celebrated in a number of parishes. We can all concede that there have been abuses. And so to answer your question directly, it's been the abuses and the way that the new rite has been implemented and celebrated, which I think has caused a loss of faith. Now that's my view, and I think you would agree with that. When I go when I see a Novus Ordo parish where the priest is saying the long canon, he alone is giving Holy Communion, people are going up to a kneeler and receiving on the tongue. There's nothing evil about that at all. That's gloriously Catholic. But if you go to a Novus Ordo Mass where you got lay Eucharistic ministers giving communion in the hand, which is downplaying the real presence, and you've got horrible music and bad sermons, okay, both rites are the same. They're using the same missal. And that proves it is not the missal itself, but it's the way that they've abused the way in which it's celebrated. You see, the one missal is being celebrated in two completely contradictory ways. And that, I think, is what has introduced all the problems in the loss of faith.
Okay, and how could you answer if I told you that, in spite the Novus Ordo not being intrinsically evil, we can prove with studies, with academic studies, that it was it has like it is Protestant like
What parts?
I don't know. I mentioned I have not studied them. All the studies that which you know better than me.
Okay, and I know you don't necessarily take this position, but we're having a mock debate here. If you're going to say that it's Protestant, then you have to show me where.
All right.
Where is it Protestant? I can tell you, if I look at the rite itself, there's nothing Protestant about the rite itself. Is some of the music Protestant in some of these Novus Ordo parishes? Absolutely. Is the flavor of Protestantism promoted in some of these Novus Ordo parishes? Absolutely. I concede that, but I don't concede that it's the rite itself. That's the problem. There's a distinction between the rite itself in black and white and the way that some of these liberals and modernists have celebrated and implemented it.
All right. Another question is isn't the new mass illicit because it is going contrary to quo primum?
Is it illicit? No, of course not. It was promulgated by the supreme authority of the church, the Roman pontiff, who has the right to create new liturgies. I mean, this has been the teaching of the church. Look at Pius XII's teaching in Mediator Dei, where Pius XII says the Pope has the right not only to update and make modifications to current liturgies, but even as the right to introduce new rites to the church.
All right, and I understand that, but quo primum says explicitly that we can change absolutely anything of the Tridentine Mass.
Well, that's not true, because St. Pius V himself changed the rubrics, and the rubrics have been changed by many popes subsequent to St. Pius V's declaration.
Okay, so he was not talking literally in quo primum.
He wasn't binding his successors, because a pope can't bind another pope in disciplinary matters. And when you're talking about the liturgy, it's necessarily a disciplinary matter. The liturgy expresses dogma, it expresses doctrine, but the way in which the liturgy is celebrated, right, is a discipline. It's a liturgical discipline, and the Pope can't bind a future Pope to his disciplines. Okay,
I get it. And what about the Ottavian intervention, which says that the new Mass departs from the traditional doctrine of the sacrifice?
Okay, do you know who wrote the Ottavian intervention?
Ottavian and Bacci?
No, they didn't. The study has been falsely attributed to Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani. He didn't write it. This is a myth of the traditional movement. It was written by De Laurier and a woman who evidently was involved in the occult. This has been falsely attributed to the good name of Cardinal Ottaviani. The reality of this for the trad world is that Ottaviani actually wrote a letter of approbation to Dom Lanford's study of the new Mass, which was favorable to the new Mass. Okay, and we've raised this issue. I had one of my colleagues, Dom Del Maso, help translate Dom Lanford's study, which Ottaviani wrote. So again, this is another myth of the traditional movement that is simply has no basis in reality. That critique was written by a Sedevacantist, not Ottaviani.
Okay, enough with the new Mass issue. We'll go now to doctrine, to Second Vatican Council. Okay, the second objection says as follows: the Vatican II teaches error and heresy, so the SSPX is right, for example, about...
Okay, you got to stop there and tell me where the heresy is.
For example, collegiality, religious liberty, and...
Okay, stop there. Collegiality. What's heretical about Vatican II's teaching on collegiality?
Yes, collegiality says there are two subjects of supreme authority. So that goes contrary to the dogma of the primacy, right?
No, absolutely not. And this is an error of the Society of St. Pius X because they conflate the primacy with supreme authority. You've just identified the error. They conflate the primacy with supreme authority. The Pope alone has the primacy, okay? But when Christ gave Peter the keys of the kingdom of heaven and said to you individually, Peter, whatever you bind or loose is bound in heaven, he also gave a share in the supreme authority collectively to the College of Bishops when he says in Matthew 18, whatever you in the plural bind or loose on earth is bound or loose in heaven. That is on earth, the universal power, universal jurisdiction. That is separate and distinct from the primacy. And this, again, is where the society has made a blatant error, a blatant conflation of two different things. The Pope alone has the primacy. The Pope alone does have supreme jurisdiction individually, but the College of Bishops collectively share in supreme jurisdiction as the episcopate when they are in hierarchical communion with the Holy Father. Okay, so not only is Lumen Gentium not heretical, it expresses beautifully the doctrine of the Church on the episcopate.
And can you explain me why this teaching is not found in previous magisterium?
It is. The Church has always taught that Christ established two divine offices, if you will, the office of the primacy and the office of the episcopate. That's revealed truth that's been taught throughout the ages. Many theologians even claim that Lumen Gentium is making a definitive statement that must be held with the assent of faith in Lumen Gentium when it talks about and gives details about the College of Bishops. But all Catholics know or should know that the constitution of the Church is composed of a primacy and an episcopate. And Vatican I addressed the primacy and Vatican II addressed the episcopate. It gave clarification and further, I think, doctrinal insights on the nature of it. And I'm sure the Church will continue to do that. But, you know, those two divine institutions, if you will, that make up the Holy Roman Catholic Church have been taught from the very beginning by Christ. Christ founded it that way.
All right. And is this teaching with the same words of Lumen Gentium found in preconciliar theology?
What words?
The words, there are two subjects of supreme authority.
Oh, yes. And I'd have to look at the encyclicals, but I can tell you, and I have this in my article, so I'm not just blowing smoke at you. I can tell you in all of the pre-Vatican II theology manuals that I've read, and I cite close to a dozen, and there are more, they all refer to the distinction between the primacy and supreme authority, and that there are two subjects of supreme authority.
All right.
They refer to that.
So if the SSPX is right, then all those theologians are heretics as well, right?
Right. Now, you started with the premise that collegiality is a heresy. Okay. We've just shown, and not only is it not a heresy, it's always been taught. I mean, it's revealed truth. I mean, this is revealed. The way Christ established the Church has been revealed in Scripture, right? And it's been taught through the ages of the episcopate and the primacy. So, I mean, we've just shown that it's far from being heretical. It's been the constant teaching.
Okay, and what is the consequence of some organization which says that a traditional teaching is heretical?
What is your question again?
What is the consequence or the penalty that should be inflicted on our organization which says that a traditional doctrine is heretical or that the magisterium in a council has taught heresy?
Well, to reject the divine constitution of the Church, you're separating from the Church. You know, you're not giving the assent to truths that have been revealed and have been taught as either revealed or at least to be definitively held by the Church and her perennial magisterium. So that's a problem. You know, like a Catholic, who would be rejecting these things would be in heresy. They would be at least making materially heretical statements.
All right. Now going on to religious liberty. I read Lefebvre's books, for example, and I can see that there is a explicit contradiction between the previous magisterium and the Second Vatican II.
This one right here, right? It's actually
Yes.
pretty good. It's a pretty good book. I think it's a good book.
So if there is contradiction, and the SSPX is the one who says so, who maintains that position, isn't the SSPX ministry justified?
Well, of course not. First of all, you started by saying these are 3 teachings of Vatican II which are heretical. Now, when you say that, can you tell me what you mean by heresy?
No, I mean heresy only collegiality, because the SSPX says so. But
okay,
religious liberty,
you're not saying religious liberty is heretical.
No, it's an error, theological error.
I've written about this, Ezekiel, for many years. In fact, I have some extensive writings going back over 15 years ago, where I even debated Father Brian Harrison about what I perceive to be the problems in the document. And I still think that it can be interpreted in a very problematic way. I've read all of the encyclicals on religious liberty going back to the 1700s. However, there's in my view, no direct error or blatant contradiction between what the church has taught in the past and what Dignitatis Humanae teaches. When you read Dignitatis Humanae in the context of the church saying that man has a civil right to religious liberty in a non-Catholic state, if the Dignitatis Humanae is read in that context, this is how I have come to reconcile it with what the church has said in the past. There's nothing wrong with that. If the document is meant to mean that a man has a right from God, a moral faculty to worship any way he wants, that would be a problem. That is not true. Man does not have a right to worship, a divine right, a gift, a moral faculty, an innate right, if you want to call it, to worship any way he sees fit. He only has a right to worship the way God has revealed. However, the church has said in the past, in many, many places, that when you're dealing with non-Catholic states, even though man does not have a divine right, if you will, to worship outside the church, he can be granted a civil right to do that, because the civil right protects the greater good from the common good from greater evils. And if you go in and you look at the context of what Dignitatis Humanae is saying there, especially in, I think it's section 4, it's really talking about, the greater good in a civil context. And that's the way it can be looked at. Now, I read Archbishop Lefebvre's book. He makes some very good points. I've read Michael Davies' book on it. And again, I've fairly well read on this topic. I studied it for 15 years. There are ways where this document can be interpreted in a heterodox fashion. I concede that immediately. But there are also ways that, with, I think, some difficulty, it can be reconciled. But Ezekiel, even conceding that Dignitatis Humanae may teach error, let's concede that for the sake of argument.
Let's concede that.
Yeah, that doesn't matter. Yeah, that doesn't matter to me as a Catholic, because the teachings in Dignitatis Humanae have not been presented either as divinely revealed or truths that must be definitively held as Catholics. They're not presented that way, and therefore they're only part of what the church calls the authentic, non-infallible, non-binding magisterium, which by default I must give an assent of intellect and will to it. But for those who are well-read and may have difficulties with it, one might even be free to suspend judgment on it. Not to accuse the magisterium of heresy, which is what the society does, but to say, you know what, I'm waiting for further clarification on this matter because there's some things that I just can't work out. Okay? So I don't get real worried about that, because it's not like the church is presenting something to us that is binding us to error. It's not.
Okay.
This is
Same
not.
thing happens with the ecumenism teachings, right?
Yeah, it does. I mean, what is ecumenism? That's the other thing, right? I mean, we don't believe I believe in God the Father, I believe in ecumenism. They don't even define ecumenism. If we were to interpret what Vatican II teaches or means about ecumenism, we just have to go back to Pius XII and what he taught about it. Well, ecumenism is sharing the gospel to convert people to the Roman Catholic Church. That's what ecumenism means. Now, it has to start somewhere. So in order to proclaim the gospel, you try to seek common ground with non-Catholics, scripture being one of them, I think the best one. And so there's common ground there. And I think if we understand ecumenism in the context of trying to seek common ground to begin a dialogue and to, for the purpose of converting souls to the Catholic Church, there's nothing wrong with that. Has it been abused? Of course it's been abused, because the ultimate goal of ecumenism is to save these people's souls, and they can only be saved in the Catholic Church. So again, we have to make a distinction between what the document is actually teaching and how things have been carried out and implemented by those who I think have abused these teachings.
All right. So the SSPX says it is impossible to make a hermeneutic of continuity, right?
Well, no, because Bishop Fillet has said just the opposite. If you believe Bishop Fillet, he said 95% of Vatican II is fine. It's traditional. It's the only 5% that they have a problem with. And so he informally at least said that he can certainly reconcile things, at least 95% of the documents. Unfortunately, he didn't go all the way with that and accept the conditions that would have integrated them into the Roman Catholic Church. But how can one argue that there's no hermeneutic of continuity? You'll have to show me, Ezekiel, and again, as a devil's advocate, you have to show me what specific statement within the conciliar documents can't be reconciled with tradition. Show me that blatant, impossible contradiction. Otherwise, we're bound to interpret them in light of tradition, which is what the church has said. I mean, Autorem Fide, the Holy Father there said that, we need to condemn heretical interpretations of the magisterium outright and try to interpret them in light of tradition.
All right. There is also an opinion, I don't know if you heard it, but I heard it. There is a theologian in the SSPX, which is called Father Calderon, who says that every teaching of the magisterium since Vatican II has no magisterial authority, because the magisterium doesn't, the people of the magisterium don't want to teach anybody. There's a lack of intention.
Well, then he believes the church has defected, because the Roman Catholic Church will always have a magisterium. It will always have a college of bishops. This is also the problem with sedevacantism. Sedevacantism denies the indefectibility of the church because they say we don't have a magisterium anymore. Well, that denies indefectibility. And that's another dogma of the faith. So to say that they have no magisterial authority is nonsense. Even the profession of faith, which, by the way, the society rejects, says that even when the magisterium is teaching in a non-binding way, that is, even when the successor of Peter is not teaching as Peter with the keys, is not binding the church, it's still coming from the magisterium. So it's still authentic. It's coming from the official teaching office of the church. Again, not protected by the charism of infallibility in that case, but still one that we owe religious deference to. As Christ said, he hears you, hears me, hear the church, take it to the church, which in the scriptures, that even appears to be on a disciplinary matter. So no, again, these blanket statements are very dangerous. To say that the magisterium no longer teaches with authority, what does that really mean? That's nonsense.
All right. So if we concede for a second that the new mass is evil, collegiality is a heresy.
And I don't concede any of that.
No. I mean, this is a question I want to ask you. Let us suppose that we concede that, Vatican II teaches.
I'm not going to concede that, but go ahead.
Okay.
I can prove it's false. I can actually prove it's false, but go ahead.
Okay. If we concede that, even if that was true, if the SSPX was saying the truth about that, its ministry of the word and of the sacraments would be legitimate and licit?
Of course not. Why?
But they would be saying the truth. They would be the only ones who would be saying the truth.
Well, okay, let's concede that I can't square, a round hole. So no, we can't concede that. And we don't concede that. But no, if you're saying that those who teach the truth are in union with the church, well, some Protestants teach some truth. The fact is the society doesn't preach the truth. They preach a lot of error and heresy. So does that now disqualify them? And what I mean by that is they reject the divinely revealed truth that one must have a mission from the Holy Father. That's divinely revealed. And those who say that bishops can be sent without canonical or ecclesiastical power, let them be anathema. Okay, well, the society rejects that. It's also a divine truth that one must be united to the government of the church. That's not ecclesiastical. That's divine law, divinely revealed, taught by Leo XIII in Satis Cognitum and by Pius XII in Mystici Corpus Christi. So the society rejects divinely revealed truths. And even if they want to profess them with their lips, they certainly can't reconcile the fact that they reject them in practice. They're not part of the Roman Catholic Church. They're not subject to the church's government. They don't have a juridical mission from the Holy Father. They reject the profession of faith, and on and on and on. So if you want to use the standard of truth as the litmus test, you might as well dismiss the society, because they reject some of the most fundamental dogmas of the Catholic faith in practice.
All right. And here I want to ask you a question, because I don't know this with my memory, but I have heard from the SSPX that there are many canons even in the new Code of Canon Law which justify the SSPX ministry. Which would be those?
None of them. That's my answer. But if you wanted from their position, yeah, I mean, they'll say Canon 1335, for example, will say gives a Catholic a right to approach any minister for any just cause. And if the minister's under censure, then that censure would be lifted. Now, that's what Canon 1335 effectively says. The problem with that, Ezekiel, and this is what some of the society priests have said is the canon that covers everything for the society. The problem with that is Canon 1335 is not suppletory. It doesn't provide mission. It doesn't provide the priest what is necessary to act licitly. So to the extent one would approach a priest under censure and ask him for the sacraments or a sacramental, and to the extent that the canon lifts that censure, that priest then reverts back to his pre-censured state. And in his pre-censured state, a diocesan priest would have mission. He'd have faculty, whereas a society priest would not. And the canon doesn't provide anything to the society priest that makes what he's going to do licit, because he starts with no mission at all. Okay. So even if that operates to lift censures, he does not have a canonical mission. None of the priests of the society are incarnated into bishops with ordinary jurisdiction. And so any act that they would perform remains illicit. So that's one of the canons, I would say. They also use Canon 144, which is a canon dealing with supplied jurisdiction, and they've abused that canon as well. Canon 144 says where there is a common error or positive probable doubt. Common error typically refers to a Catholic community, whereas positive and probable doubt refers to the priest. But the society has abused that canon as well in applying it to their circumstances, and it's an abuse because common error, number one, only applies to a Catholic community, that is a community in union with the local bishop, which society people are not when they're in their chapels. And number two, the error that's involved concerns whether that Catholic community could make a judgment that a priest has been lawfully sent by the bishop. And once again, nobody would conclude that a society priest was lawfully sent by the bishop, not only because it's common knowledge and the society priests themselves say that they're not sent by the bishop, but they're also under censure, for illicitly celebrating the sacraments, which automatically bars them from availing themselves of ecclesia supplei. So that's another. Those are two that come to mind. There are others, 1248 on the Mass. It's funny, Ezekiel, they criticize Canon 844-2, which deals with sacramental sharing in limited circumstances, where Catholic priests give the sacraments to non-Catholics if they manifest Catholic faith in the judgment of the priest. Well, they criticize that, and yet the society priests are not technically Catholic ministers because they're not part of the Roman Catholic Church with a juridical mission, and hence they're the ones that actually are promoting sacramental sharing, and they're not in their non-Catholic chapels. So that's an irony, but yes, those are the ones that come to mind.
And another question here is, many times we as apologists are criticized of being, what they call legalists, but they seem to be legalists too in applying to the canon law so many times, right?
They're legalists to the in a lot of minutia. We're talking divine law here, though, right? I mean, okay, sure, they have a lot of errors in their canon law, but canonical mission and being part of the divine government of the church, those are issues of the divine law. That's how Christ set up the church, what he has revealed to us, the nature of the church. And so there's nothing, legalistic about that when we're speaking of the divine law and what is necessary to be a legitimate Catholic minister and a member of the body of Christ.
Can you explain very briefly and synthetically what is the traditional doctrine of mission, which I think many traditionalists do not know and end up rejecting it in the practice? Is that a matter of ecclesiastical law or is it a matter of divine law?
Yeah, good question, Ezekiel. Mission is almost, when we talk about God and his nature, mission is almost who God is in a way when you think about the Father sending the Son. And the Holy Ghost proceeding from the Father and the Son. So as the Father sends the Son, the Son sends the apostles. This is all rooted in the divine nature of who God is, his love for humanity, and how he wants his love for humanity to be carried out through the salvation of souls, which is done by mission. So as Christ is sent, Christ then sends his apostles in the same way that the Father has sent him. And it is Christ who, when a man accepts an election to the papacy, it is Christ who actually joins the matter to the form, who makes the man the papacy. And at that point, it is Christ who gives the Pope immediate plenary and supreme jurisdiction over the church. What happens then? Well, then the Pope, through mission, gives that jurisdiction to his bishop. So it comes from Christ to the bishop, to the Pope, and then out to the bishops. And then the bishops, through incarnation, delegate jurisdiction to the priests and so forth. So delegate's not the word necessarily. But so you can see how central this is to who God is and how he's willed to save souls. It is through the mission of his mystical body, the church militant, the Roman Catholic Church, the church militant on earth. And so we're dealing with what has been divinely revealed to us. There is nothing that can justify the circumvention of mission, of what Pius XII called juridical mission, because it comes from Christ himself. There will never be a crisis so grave that we can circumvent the very way that God wills the salvation of souls, because it's through mission that souls are saved.
Okay, and what about a very grave, very critical state of necessity?
There can be no grave state of necessity that could circumvent mission. Mission is carried out for the salvation of souls. Now, I would turn the question on you and say, what kind of crisis? What do you mean?
You can hardly find a Catholic, traditional Catholic priest who preaches the truth, who administer good the sacraments, who will lead you to heaven.
You can't. I can find many of them.
I can find them, but it is not so easy.
Well, so what does that mean? Does that mean that you can go to one who hasn't been sent by the church?
I don't know if they preach the sound doctrine and.
Well, first of all, their whole ministry is rooted in something that's contrary to the will of Jesus Christ. Christ hasn't sent them. St. Paul says, how can I preach unless I'm sent? That's divine revelation. Okay. So if someone comes to you with a different gospel, let him be anathema. To the extent that that minister has not been sent by the church, by canonical power, as Trent says, he should be rejected. Now, if he has been sent by canonical power and he's preaching a different gospel, then ignore him.
Let me ask you something here, because Lefebvre, when founding the SSPX, he was sent with canonical power. So,
no, and it depends what you mean by that. No, he had no subjects. He was not a bishop with ordinary jurisdiction. The Society of St. Pius X was founded upon the approval of the diocesan bishop. Lefebvre was only given the permission to help form these seminarians in the traditional rites, but he had no ordinary jurisdiction. He wasn't a diocesan bishop. He didn't have subjects. So in that sense, no, he didn't have a mission like a diocesan bishop would have.
Because what I have seen is that in the past few years, the SSPX has published a document arguing that Lefebvre never lost the mission, or the SSPX never lost its initial canonical status, because all the penalties inflicted upon Lefebvre and the SSPX were invalid.
I've written extensively about that and spoken extensively about that. I mean, just to recap, the society was founded upon the approval of the local bishop as an ad experimentum lay association, okay, a pious union, meaning it had a canonical shelf life, in this case of 6 years, at which time it was going to expire. And Lefebvre agreed to those terms and conditions. A pious union is a creature of human ecclesiastical law. It has no divine right to exist, okay? And just as the local bishop approved its existence, so the local bishop had the same authority to suppress its existence. And oh, by the way, it was not just suppressed by the local bishop, but it was suppressed by the Holy Father himself. So a mere creature of ecclesiastical law that had a temporary existence under canon law can most certainly be suppressed by its authorities, most especially the supreme authority of the Roman Catholic Church.
All right, but if it was not because of Lefebvre, we would not have the traditional Latin Mass, right?
Wrong. Again,
Why?
why? Well, that's an argument, number one, from pure speculation. Number two, we had the traditional Mass before Lefebvre did his schismatic consecrations. It was being allowed under John Paul II to be celebrated. I mean, look at Quator ab Inc. Annos, I believe the document is, from 1984. And go read that document and read how the Holy Father had gave permission to celebrate the Mass. In fact, if you read the document, John Paul II wanted to make sure that the Mass was celebrated according to the 62 rubrics. He didn't want any English. He said it has to be celebrated in Latin. He says there can be no mixing and matching with the Novus Ordo. So this was going on. And I know this for a fact, Ezekiel, because in Milwaukee, even though we were in an extremely liberal diocese here, at the time, Archbishop Rembert Weekland was our bishop, and he was certainly no friend of liturgical orthodoxy. And yet in Milwaukee alone, I know of a half a dozen priests who continued to celebrate the traditional Mass with absolutely no issue. And I know this is the case in other parts of the country and other parts of the world. So to say that, Lefebvre somehow saved the Mass is nonsense. It was going on, and there's factual basis for that all over the place.
Yeah, another argument is that if it was not because of the SSPX, we would not have the Fraternity of St. Peter or our Institute Christ the King, right?
Well, God brings good out of evil.
All right, but you said that the SSPX has no canonical mission, but don't they have canonical mission because Benedict XVI lifted up the excommunications to every bishop, and also Francis now permits confessions and matrimony, so they have canonical mission to do confessions and matrimonies.
No,
right?
it doesn't mean that at all. In order for a bishop to have mission, he has to be in hierarchical communion with the Holy Father. And typically, it's not just that, but he's either appointed as head of a diocese, or if not, in which case, he would have subjects. He would be at least an auxiliary bishop, again, with ordinary jurisdiction. The society bishops, while they were validly consecrated, they were never given a canonical mission because they were born out of a schismatic act, and hence are not in hierarchical communion, and hence don't have ordinary mission or jurisdiction. Now, having said that, the Pope Francis has given them the faculty to hear confession. That doesn't mean that the entire ministry is licit at all, because nothing has changed with respect to the status of the bishops and the priests. It only means that the priests can validly absolve. And if you read why Francis did that, is because he was worried about the invalidity of these confessions for so many years. And that's because supplied jurisdiction doesn't apply. So we can be thankful for that. Now, you said also marriages, Ezekiel, you mentioned that the reality is that's conditional. It's up to the diocesan bishop whether the diocesan bishop wants to send a properly delegated priest to witness the marriage, or if that's impossible, he could give the faculty to a society priest, again, for the purpose of the benefit of these souls. But we also know that the society disregards this. They continue to carry on with illicit marriages where that permission is not granted, you see. And so they're again evincing a refusal to submit to the will of the Holy Father, who has not said, society, you're free to witness marriages. No, he has said that it's going to be up to the local bishop. Now, he wants the local bishop to give the permission, but it's in the bishop's discretion. He regulates marriages in his diocese, and he can decide who is sent and who is not sent. Okay, so these things do not give the society clergy an ordinary a mission, a canonical mission, nor does it mean that the priests are incarnated under any bishops with ordinary jurisdiction. These are limited faculties.
Okay, so in spite of the lifting up of excommunications, they are still irregular.
Of course, yeah. I mean, the lifting of the excommunications, Benedict explained that he lifted that juridical impediment, that censure, because it was an impediment to bring them into communion with the church. He did this because he wanted the society to be regularized into the church. And, there were rumors after Bishop Fillet rejected the conditions that he was going to excommunicate them again. Now, that didn't happen. But even though it didn't happen, we know the purpose for the lifting of the excommunication in 2009 was to remove the legal impediment that automatically prevents communion with the church. You see, once that legal or juridical impediment is moved, then they can move forward with a reconciliation, sacramental absolution and agreement to terms, but that had to be done as a first and necessary step. And removing a censure is not suppletory. It doesn't provide mission. It's just a step toward a reconciliation, which unfortunately hasn't happened yet. Okay, and what about, you mentioned schismatic consecrations, but here my objection is that there is a new concept of schism. Schism traditionally is the saying that the Pope is not the Pope, right? And now they change the definition. That's heresy. That sounds like heresy to me. Because traditionally, schism is not only to disobey the Pope, but to disregard him as the Supreme Pontiff, right? No, wrong. This is frankly, this is a new definition that I think was invented by Bishop Schneider and those who follow him, where they say the society are not in schism because they at least acknowledge the Pope in principle. That's not the definition of schism. Read Canon 751. The definition of schism is refusal of submission to the Holy Father, his authority and jurisdiction, or refusing communion with those subject to him. So it's not the concept that Bishop Schneider claims that schism is the refusal to recognize the Pope as the successor of Peter. That's heresy. It's recognizing that he's the Pope and yet refusing his authority and his jurisdiction. That's the schism.
Right. So you mentioned Bishop Schneider. I have another question there. If the SSPX if the SSPX is so wrong as we are saying here, why there are like Bishop Schneider, Vigano, Strickland, and others who say they are in full communion or that they are Catholic? Because they are like reference in.
Well, yeah. I mean, do you follow the Pope, or do you follow bishops who have no authority over you? Because John Paul II has declared the society to be in schism. And he has said that anybody who formally adheres to the schism is excommunicated. Okay. In fact, John Paul II not only referred to the society of being in schism, but so did Benedict XVI, and so did Pope Francis. Francis also referred to the schism of Monsignor Lefebvre. They've all recognized that there is a schism there. Okay. So if you're a Roman Catholic and you recognize that the Holy Father is your supreme authority, then the buck stops there. I don't care what Archbishop Vigano says, especially now where he appears to be a public sedevacantist. He appears that way. If so, then he's a notorious schismatic himself. I hope that's not the case, but that appears to be the case. And I hope these other clerics that you mentioned are not on that slippery slope, but it really doesn't matter to me what they say. And frankly, other clerics have said the contrary. What has Cardinal Burke said, who's one of the brightest minds of the church? He head of the Apostolic Signatura, doctor of canon law. What is Cardinal Mueller? What have they said? Archbishop Pozo, who was trying to help with the reconciliation of the society. They've all referred to the schism. So it's not like, my cardinal or bishop is better than yours. I mean, we could play that game if you want, but the reality is the Holy Father has said it in a formal declaration, in that Ecclesia de Afflicta. And of course, it's not even in dispute. The Pope John Paul II wouldn't have had to even say they're in schism, because Catholics should know that consecrating a bishop contrary to the Holy Father's will is necessarily a schismatic act, because you're usurping a right of the Roman primacy. The right to choose, select, and consecrate bishops belongs to the Pope alone, which is also, again, a matter of divine law, and one of the many examples where the society simply rejects what has been divinely revealed.
Okay, and here I have another point, because we are criticizing the SSPX, but the SSPX only rejects 3 doctrines of Vatican II and the New Mass.
Now, well, they reject a lot more than that. I just told you all the things they reject, so that's not true.
Okay, but we agree that many of the Novus Ordo Church priests and hierarchy reject the main dogmas of our faith. So why are we focusing in the SSPX and not in this apostasy of within the church?
As an apologist, I'm going to do battle with anybody that's opposing the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church, whether on the right or the left. I battle them all. I battle liberals. I've been battling the liberal faction of the church for 25 years. But again, we're dealing also with errors on the right, Ezekiel. And I would say that the errors on the right can be even more pernicious, even more dangerous, because they lead people out of the juridical structure, the visible society, the social unit of the church. A lot of these errors, are errors in ecclesiology and the nature of the church. We're talking about mission and her divine governance, jurisdiction, and so forth. This deals with the foundational elements of the Roman Catholic Church. And when you reject those things, you are actually separating yourself from the church. Now, the liberals, a lot of them teach a lot of wishy-washy stuff, and some of them are just outright teaching heresy. There's no question about that. And, St. Pius X talked about how these modernists live in the hearts and veins of the church. That's why they're so insidious. That's why they can do so much damage. Okay. However, this extreme right-wing movement is actually leading people right out of the Catholic Church, We see that because now they're going to bishops and priests who have no mission and who actually now attack Holy Mother Church. If you see the people that are, in this movement, it's not just that they're preaching, what they think is the gospel. They're attacking the Holy Father and the entire episcopate and the Roman Catholic Church. And they're saying the institutional church, as they call it, is totally corrupt. And this leads to a false understanding what the church is, because they're creating a distinction between what they call the institutional church and the church militant on earth, and even the mystical body of Christ, which are grave errors. So, again, to answer your question, there are errors all over the place, but we need to address them on both sides.
Okay, and another objection that I hear a lot from people of the SSPX is, hey, the SSPX is full of good fruits. The seminaries are full of seminarians. The mass is great. Is solemn. That there is plenty of kids and families with a lot of kids. So the fruits are good. So how can you criticize that?
The fruits are horrible, you can say. I could argue just the opposite. What are the fruits but decade after decade of rebellion and schism? I mean, I'm not saying that there aren't large families and there's not a lot mass attendance, but I mean, we can see that in other heretical sects as well. You'll see that in Sedevacantist sects. You'll see that in the Old Catholics. You'll see that among certain Protestant groups. That doesn't prove anything. The bottom line is, what has God revealed and what does the church teach? And are they legitimate Catholic ministers? So, judging by their fruits, there's a lot of rotten fruit here, okay? Archbishop Lefebvre, start with him. I mean, is it a good fruit for a retired archbishop to call the Holy Father an antichrist, and refer to the conciliar popes as antichrists, teaching a new religion? And is it a good fruit that this retired archbishop says that the Roman Catholic Church no longer exists, which is a denial of her indefectibility? I mean, are those good fruits? Absolutely not. Is a good fruit that there's been so many ruptures within the society, not only internally, but now with the resistance, and now the resistance to the resistance, and all the rest of it, and a lot of them being closet sedevacantists? The fruits, you can sum them up, Ezekiel, they're rotten. You can't just judge a book by its cover because everybody goes to mass on Sunday and they've got large families. That's not the regula. Okay, the regula is whether they are in communion with the Roman Catholic Church and the Vicar of Christ, outside of which there's no salvation, right? That's a dogma that every human creature must be subject to the Roman pontiff to save their soul. They're not subject to the Roman pontiff. So the fruits are rotten.
All right. And they also say that they are not in schism because they recognize the Pope and they also pray for him in the Mass, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've already addressed this. Giving him lip service in the Mass doesn't create a juridical reality whereby they're now subject to the church, the governance of the church, and in submission to the Roman pontiff. I mean, the Old Catholics actually mention Francis in the Mass too, and yet the Society of St. Pius X would be the first to say the Old Catholics aren't schismatics. Well, they mention Francis in the canon, so that doesn't create communion with them.
Okay. And what about, for example, Castrillo Hoyos from the Ecclesia Dei, who said that the SSPX is not in schism?
Well, again, John Paul II said that they are, so I obey the Holy Father on that. But Hoyos was nuanced in what he said. If you read the context of his interviews, and I think he gave 4 or 5 interviews, and I've documented all of them in my notes, he was nuanced. He made a distinction between a schism and a consolidated schism, I think is the word that he used, where he was actually referring to all the people who go to the chapels. And I think he was right to say all those people are not necessarily schismatics just because they go to Mass. My own bishop told me the same thing. So there is a distinction that we must make between the individuals who are attending society masses for that reason and the fact that the movement of Monsignor Lefebvre is schismatic. If
Right.
anybody formally adheres to the movement, then they're a schismatic because they're excommunicated. But whether there's formal or material adherence is a question, right? And if there's not formal adherence, they wouldn't be schismatic. There's problems with that, and the church has warned about that, because when you put yourself in the society milieu, as you will, you ultimately, are at risk to imbibing that schismatic mentality. And, we can speak to personal experience of how many people have changed, for the worse, the longer they stay in the society and the more hardened they get. But, words like those of Cardinal Hoyos and others have to be, critically looked at, because there are distinctions there that people often don't understand.
Okay, and what is formal adherence?
Well, the church hasn't defined it. However, the PSIL, to the Pontifical Council for the Interpretation of Legislative Texts, which is the organ of the magisterium responsible for giving authentic interpretations of canon law, in 1996, I believe, said that in their conclusion, the clergy would be formally adhering because they know, what the mission of Archbishop Lefebvre is. And they said laity are at risk of formal adherence if they're only attending society masses at the exclusion of communion, with the rest of the church. That would be evidence of formal adherence, where the PSILT said if they're engaged in exclusively what they called Lefebvrean ecclesial acts, I think is the phrase that they used. And so people need to be aware, are you going to the society, which should be completely discouraged because it raises issues with the Sunday obligation and the whole, it's a different topic, but they should be concerned if they are only going to society masses. Are they truly refusing communion with the rest of the church, even Ecclesia Dei groups? And I brought this up at the beginning, remember, where the society was telling me, it's dangerous to go to Ecclesia Dei groups, really, right? So that's a concern that the church has on whether somebody is formally adhering.
Okay, so can you explain which of their sacraments are licit and valid, and which of them are not licit?
None of the sacraments are licit other than confession currently, and if the diocesan bishop approves the marriage, then that would be as well. To the extent that the marriage is not approved by the diocesan bishop, it's invalid. That's a totally invalid marriage. Their baptisms are valid but illicit. The masses are valid but illicit. All the sacraments are illicit other than confession and conditionally marriages.
Okay, and I have read some Ecclesia Dei answer to a dubia of the faithful, which says you can go to SSPX and fulfill your Sunday obligation, and also go to communion. Is that right?
There was a reply, and I've addressed this in a number of talks and articles. I have probably close to a dozen Ecclesia Dei replies here that I've gone through, and every single one of them, and I have this in an article, issues a negative judgment on attending society masses. They're all unanimous that the society mass cannot be attended and it doesn't fulfill the obligation. In essence, there was one outlier, which I've looked into, and I've talked to people that were involved and close to the situation as to why, in this particular case, Monsignor Pearl allowed the person to attend a society chapel. And what came of that is the ruling was that while in your particular case, it wouldn't fulfill the ecclesiastical precept under 1248, if you're going, it would at least satisfy your obligation before God to keep holy the Sabbath. And the reason Ezekiel in that case is because he didn't have anywhere else to go. It was a very rare circumstance. And the way I read that and the way others have read it is that the Ecclesia Dei Commission could have just as easily said, you know what, you can pray your rosary and not fulfill your ecclesiastical precept because you're impeded from doing so. You don't have another church to go to, but you can still keep holy the Sabbath by doing something else. And so they allowed permission in that case. Now, having said that, Monsignor Pearl came out 4 months after that, because that reply was leaked to Catholic media and said, look, the church has changed its position. Monsignor Pearl came out and said, no, that wasn't intended for publication to the masses. This was a particular situation. And by the way, all Ecclesia Dei replies are intended only for the recipients that they're directed to, that issued the dubia. They're not, really don't apply to us technically. So we can't even rely upon them, one way or another. But what we know from Catholic tradition is that we have an obligation to worship and attend Mass in union with our bishop, right? That's where it starts. We're lawfully received into the Holy Catholic Church, usually by a parish priest who's in union with his bishop, who's in union with the Holy Father, up the chain to our Lord himself, you see. So that's where it's at. And those who worship outside of that hierarchical structure are not worshiping in the Catholic Church.
Right, great. And also the SSPX has said, correct me if I'm wrong, they have said that the SSPX has the 4 marks and 3 attributes of the church. Is that right? And if that is right, are they correct in that statement?
I know. I'm sorry to laugh. It's unbelievable. I know Bishop Tissier has said this. He's written it. Of course not. Only the Roman Catholic Church, the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Those are the 4 marks, right? In our creed, the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. That is the Church of Rome and all of the dioceses and equivalents who are united to her in faith, worship, and governance. Right? So because the society is not united to the Roman Catholic Church in faith, worship, or governance as part of her juridical structure, they don't have any of the marks. They have none of them. And that can be proved very easily just by looking at the mark of apostolicity. The mark of apostolicity is the mark that I think most formally distinguishes the true church from all the false churches, because the mark of apostolicity refers to not only the material succession of bishops from the time of the apostles, but actually the formal succession, meaning that they have been given jurisdiction by the Holy Father through hierarchical communion and legal appointment. You see, none of the society bishops, none of the sedevacantist bishops, none of the old Catholic bishops, none of these independent bishops, none of them are formal successors to the apostles, because they don't have a hierarchical communion with the Holy Father. They have no jurisdiction, you see. And so that alone proves that, the society doesn't share in the church that has these 4 marks.
Yes, and all right. Another objection is that Lefebvre was a very holy man, a missionary, and he was doctor in theology. So it is weird that we are criticizing him rather than,
Oh, now all doctors in theology are holy? I mean, no. I mean, look, I've given Lefebvre his proper due in terms of him, being an evangelist and a missionary in Africa. Of course, he did some good things until he went off the rails. But he didn't end good. I mean, he ended again by calling the Vatican II popes antichrists who teach a new religion, a new priesthood, a new catechism, and so forth. And he died an excommunicated schismatic. May he rest in peace. I mean, I hope God would have mercy. But the reality is, dying an excommunicated schismatic would not make somebody, his memory shouldn't be seen as an excommunicated schismatic. I mean, Pius IX and a number of popes have said whoever is excommunicated as a schismatic can't be considered a Catholic. And this, unfortunately, is the state that he died in. So, I mean, we can pray for his soul, but no. I mean, we don't. I don't see how one can call anybody holy who spent the later years of his life attacking the Roman Catholic Church.
And Benedict lived his excommunication as well, or he didn't live?
No. Okay. Once he died excommunicated, he only lived the excommunication on the 4 bishops and I think Bishop Castro de Meyer. But Archbishop Lefebvre, the lifting of that censure, I mean, it's impossible. Archbishop Soul is no longer here, and so he wouldn't have lifted that excommunication on the Archbishop.
Okay. What about the objection that the new mass may be probably invalid because priests do not believe anymore in the real presence, so they lack intention to do what the church does?
This again, Ezekiel, is another insidious error that frankly was started by Archbishop Lefebvre.
His letter to confuse Catholics, right?
Absolutely. I've got the book here and read all about it, and it's still on society websites. The error there, and Archbishop Lefebvre and the priests and bishops to this day promote this error that the minister has to actually intend the sacramental effect. Not only that, but even understand it and have an orthodox understanding of the sacraments. That's nonsense. That's not what the church has ever said. Intention, number one, can't be judged internally by the church. So the church says that externally, intention is presumed when proper matter and proper form are used. And the minister does what the church does, not necessarily intends what the church intends. You see, there's a difference there. And so when a priest opens liturgical books and says the Mass and uses proper matter and form, we presume that he has the intention. That's how it's evinced. So this notion of sacramental intention is so wrong. It in no way, and I'm not saying that they don't have to have the intention. They do. But what I'm saying is the only thing we can judge is the intention by whether they're using proper matter and proper form, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't have certainty about any of the sacraments. And yet the society has promoted this blatant error, total error. Read all the sacramental theology books on this. And this, I believe, is one of the ways they've almost scared people into coming to their chapels alone. Because they say, to the extent that, even the ICK or the Fraternity of St. Peter, if those guys have been imbued with modernism, right? If they haven't been trained in our seminaries, they might be secret modernists and they might not have the intention to consecrate the Eucharist. You got to be careful. That's insanity. That is not how sacramental intention is taught by the church. All this nonsense about, be careful where the ICK is commingling hosts with Novus Ordo masses. And even some of the ICK priests have this erroneous understanding. It's dangerous because it is a refusal of communion with effectively the entire Roman rite. Now, I'm not saying I'm going to go to all these abusive Novus Ordo masses. That's not the point. We're addressing sacramental intention, and the priest does not have to even understand the sacramental theology. He just has to do what the church does. And when's the last time, you saw a priest not saying the words of consecration properly, or not using a proper baptismal formula, and not using water or bread or wine? You see, so the church makes it very simple for sacramental intention to take place.
Right. So there is another objection here because the SSPX makes an analogy to justify Lefebvre and the SSPX with the cases of Saint Athanasius, Saint Eusebius, and Boutilla's John Paul II's consecrations. Can you tackle the three of them?
Yeah, it's black and white. No, well, tell me where Saint Athanasius or Saint Eusebius consecrated bishops against the will of the Holy Father. If they did, they'd have a good case, right? But that's not the case. Athanasius actually obeyed his unjust excommunication. There's no record of him doing any types of illicit ordinations until the Pope called him out of exile and then praised him, sung his praises at the end of his life. And Eusebius is even different, although it was around the same time. Eusebius actually did not consecrate bishops or ordained priests contrary to the will of the Holy Father, the bishops. He was in parts of the East that didn't have any bishops, and he used the collegiate power. We talked about collegiality. Eusebius used the collegiate power to ordain priests and install pastors in those areas where there were no diocesan bishops. There were only heretics there, which, Dom Grea in his book on the episcopate very clearly explains what's going on there. So that's apples and oranges, Ezekiel. I mean, these were saintly men who were in hierarchical communion with the Holy Father. They did what they had the power to do as bishops, and they didn't contradict the will of the Holy Father.
And what is the case with Wojtyla?
Okay, well, did the Holy See accept Wojtyla's consecrations?
Yes,
they eventually did. Paul VI eventually accepted them. So that's where the rubber meets the road as a Catholic. If Paul VI said, no, those were illicit, then we'd have a different case. When Wojtyla did those consecrations behind the Iron Curtain with persecution, he felt he had to do it to save the church in that area. Again, using, if it wasn't his ordinary jurisdiction, then the collegiate power, because he was in hierarchical communion with Paul VI, and Paul VI acknowledged that and accepted the consecrations. Again, it's totally different than the Society's situation, where Lefebvre was not in hierarchical communion with the Holy Father, was under canonical censure, and expressly disobeyed a canonical warning to do exactly what he ended up doing. So there's no case in history other than all the schismatics who've done illicit consecrations throughout history, such as the Fratricelli, and the old Catholics and the like. So Lefebvre is more akin to the Protestants and Sedevacantists of the past than he is to these great saints during the Arian crisis.
Excellent. I have one more question, John. It's like a twofold question, because if it is about canon law. You mentioned supply jurisdiction. You mentioned common error. There is another allegation, which is positive and probable doubt.
Okay.
Could you explain positive and
probable
doubt?
I certainly can. Yeah, that generally applies to the priest. It happens in situations where, for example, the priest is in the confessional and he doesn't remember if his faculty actually expired or not. Let's say he was given a faculty to hear confessions in a particular diocese or for a particular convent or religious house for a year, and he's coming up on that anniversary. Okay, if he has concrete evidence in his mind that he still has the faculty, then the church would supply jurisdiction. There's a lot that's been written about this. Not a lot, but Mieszkiewicz is one of the books where he addresses Canon 209 under the old code. But that's the type of situation where positive and probable doubt come into play, where the priest himself has a positive and probable doubt that he has faculties, but he concludes based upon objective evidence that he has the faculty, in which case the church would supply. Now, you see how strict that is. In some cases where he could conclude that he may not have the faculty, then there'd be a different issue. But it deals with what the priest believes about his faculty. And this is why it doesn't apply to the society, Ezekiel, is because no priest in the society would question whether he has a faculty from the local bishop. Now they do with respect to confessions, but before that, no priest in the society would wonder, I'm in the confessional. Did Archbishop Jerome Lestecki give me faculties there? Of course not. They know that they don't have the faculty, and that's why positive and probable doubt wouldn't apply to supply the faculty to them. You see? So in the way the canonists have described this, generally, that applies in the situation of the priest. Common error applies to the situation of the Catholic community, but it's always an error or doubt concerning whether the minister has been legitimately sent by the local bishop. You see, that's where the error or doubt comes into play, which could never apply to a society priest, because they not only know, but they freely admit and even celebrate the fact that they're not part of the modernist conciliar church, and they have nothing to do with and even oppose the local bishops by setting up altar against altar. That's why
Okay.
this whole concept of supplied jurisdiction has been used by and abused. It's been so harmful to souls. Think about all of the invalid confessions and marriages that have happened in the last 40 years. It's an utter disaster.
And what will happen when Francis dies? You know, his delegation faculties will expire or not?
That's a great question. And I've talked to canonists about this, and they're divided on that. Some canonists are of the opinion that it could be a perpetual faculty, depending upon how they read how he granted it. Others say no, that it dies with the death of the Pope. If you look at the Catholic Encyclopedia, it kind of lays out the differing opinions on that. But the next Pope will have to resolve that issue for us.
Okay. And what about the danger of death, of spiritual death, and canonical equity? Those are the final questions.
Okay. Well, there's no canon in the Code of Canon Law that refers to danger of spiritual death. That's that's something that the society just made up. There's danger of physical death. That's completely different. In fact, I can quote society priests who themselves say there's no parallel between physical and spiritual death. Even some of the society priests themselves reject that argument. They don't use that argument. So it's a fallacious argument. Even a society priest, now that they have the faculty, but before when they didn't, even a society priest who's been excommunicated could absolve somebody validly and illicitly in danger of death. But when you talk about canonical equity, again, if I were debating you, I'd have you define what you mean by that. I won't do that now. I can define it for you. I mean, it effectively, it's a concept in ecclesiastical jurisprudence which allows a priest to do something where the law is not clear, okay? Because it comports with the mind of the church and the salvation of souls. I mean, there's been examples of this, like, let's say we know that we're required to receive the Eucharist with our mouth. What if somebody can't receive it with their mouth? Could you administer the Eucharist through a feeding tube, for example? This is just one example of where a priest could say, by virtue of canonical equity, I'm going to do this, even though the law doesn't provide for it or is not clear. Not that the law precludes it, it just doesn't provide for it, you see? So canonical equity certainly doesn't help the society in any event, because canonical equity, again, deals with the ecclesiastical or human laws of the church, not the divine law of the church. And as we said, you cannot circumvent the divine law, which requires mission, jurisdiction, being united to the church in governance, and adhering to the church's profession of faith, which we didn't talk about, but by the way, they reject, you see. So yes. Canonical equity doesn't help them at all, because that is only in the realm of canonical human ecclesiastical law.
Yes. Sorry, final question. What is that about the rejection of the profession of faith? What do they reject?
Well, they reject the third category of truths that the profession lays out. As you may know, Ezekiel, right, they lay out the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed, followed by three categories of truths that the magisterium teaches. The first truth is we assent with divine and Catholic faith to everything that the church proposes as revealed truth to us. So it's a revealed truth that the church proposes or teaches to us as revealed. The second is those truths which the magisterium require us to definitively hold, with firm assent to. Those truths have to be assented to with supernatural faith, divine faith. One is divine and Catholic faith. One might be called ecclesiastical faith. There's different theological views of what you actually call it, but both are supernatural divine faith. The society accepts that, as they should, of course. It's this third category, which says that if the church is not teaching in an infallible way, right, the first two ways are infallible. If the church and the Pope is not exercising his office of Peter as far as binding the church, still, we give a religious submission of intellect and will, of religious obeisance, of deference to the magisterium, because it is coming from the teaching office of the church. It may be non-binding. We don't assent to it with an assent of faith, but we submit to it as something that is coming from the teaching office of the church. And as I said, there can be room for error there. And we know this from historical examples of popes teaching error. There's this notion that, everything the authentic magisterium teaches is infallibly safe. That is not true. There can be error, and actually there can be things that might be quite damaging, but that's not covered by the charism of infallibility. It's only when the Pope teaches as Peter, when he binds or looses, that we have the assurance of infallibility. But to come back to the point, the society rejects that third category, and by rejecting that third category, they're really rejecting the four corners of the profession, because that's part of what has to be believed as a Catholic. Okay, not that the truths in the third category have to be believed with faith, but the proposition according to which I must give religious deference to an authentic teaching of the magisterium, that proposition itself has to be believed with faith, with Catholic faith, because it's part of the profession, which the church has said is like a dogma. Some theologians say these are like super dogmas when you're talking about creeds and professions. And to close the loop on this, as I point out in my articles and prove, this concept of giving religious obeisance to the magisterium in her authentic, non-infallible teachings is part of pre-Vatican II theology. This isn't something that came up at Vatican II and in the 83 Code. No, not at all. And it's common sense, right? It's hear the church. Okay, we hear the church. He who hears you hears me. Knowing that some popes have taught errors. I can talk about a number of them. Pope Nicholas giving a heretical baptismal formula. Pope Gregory saying that one spouse could leave the other spouse because the one spouse was incontinent and couldn't have relations. I mean, these are teachings of the authentic magisterium that were not binding and were erroneous and even harmful, if embraced by the entire church. So no, we have to make the proper distinctions. And again, I don't understand how the society could reject that third category of truths, but it has. And that's because Lefebvre did. Lefebvre was clear. We don't reject it. The reason I think Ezekiel, he rejected it is because he didn't want to give any submission to Vatican II. He didn't want to give any submission. But the irony of that is that category is almost their get out of jail free card in a way, because you know what? If we acknowledge that much of what Vatican II taught was only authentic and non-binding and non-infallible, well, then we can have reservations about some of the novel teachings, those statements that appear to be novel to us. We absolutely can. We're free to debate them. We're free to talk about them and to show how they may comport or may not comport with Catholic teaching. That's because they're Category 3 teachings. And so, again, the irony is they've rejected, a proposition that I think helps them more than anything.
Okay, have I forgotten any talking point of the SSPX? An important one?
I don't think so. You hit me with a bunch of them.
All right. So, as some closing remarks, would you like to say something about how to? Because we have shown that the SSPX is not a possibility. Catechism is also not a possibility. So, if you want to be a Catholic, a traditional Catholic, in the midst of this crisis, the terrible crisis of the church, of this infiltrated modernist, I think this infiltration of modernism. I mean,
it's there. It's there. I acknowledge it, and I have for many, many years. I know what Our Lady said, and I know, I know that we're suffering a crisis, but I ask myself, how is the crisis affecting me? Like Ezekiel, how does this crisis really affect you in your spiritual life? I mean, are you committing yourself to mental prayer every day? Are you praying the office? Are you praying with the mind of the church? If you do that and you get the grace of God and have a peace, you weather these storms, right? I mean, our Lord himself was sleeping in the boat, when the waves were pounding it. I think, ask yourself the question, how is this crisis really relevant to you? Just because the Pope has gone off the rails and a lot of the bishops aren't fighting for the faith, why does that matter to you? Okay, I have my Catholic faith. I have our Lord. I have Our Lady. I'm in union with my bishop. If he tells me to do something that's sinful or that's outside the scope of his authority, I'm not going to do it. Okay, I'm not going to do it. But we don't interact with our bishops or even our priests on a daily basis, right? So how is this crisis really affecting you? I would suggest that if it is affecting you and causing you angst, then your house is not in order the way it should be. I think you need to take an inventory of your spiritual life and get back to what's important, saving your soul. Because if you're so worried about this crisis, that's going to impede your spiritual progress, right? I don't know how these guys, some of whom I've never heard of, come out and have their own podcasts, and that's all they do is talk about how bad the church is. I wonder what kind of spiritual life these people actually have, right? Because if you're dwelling on this all the time, it's going to take you away from Christ and the Sacred Heart of Jesus, really. So, everybody know your Catholic faith, live your Catholic faith, pray, and remember that this is all in God's hands. God is testing the limits of our faith right now. I believe that. And this shows, with this latest document on, the purported blessing of sodomite couples, this shows just how far Christ is willing to permit evils to befall the church. It's a test of faith. Think about this as a test of faith, and think about you being in battle and fighting the principalities and powers in the heavenly places that are against Christ. So, I would say make your life more spiritual. Thank God for your Catholic faith, and don't let this divert you from the end game, which is saving your soul.
Okay, John, thank you very much. Let's end up with a prayer.
Yes.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.
Amen.
Pater noster qui es in celi, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra.
Panem nostrum quotidianum de nobis hodie, dimite nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimitibus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Amen.
Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti.
Amen.
All right, John, thank you very much.
Thank you. It was great to finally do this.
Yes, thank you.
All right. God bless you.
God bless you.
Si te gusta el contenido, podés donar lo que vos quieras en Patreon, en PayPal o en Mercado Pago. Están todos los links, toda la información en el comentario de este video.